The Israeli soldier walked among the rubble of the building until he got into position to shoot. Inside, one of the Hamas men defended himself with grenades and an AK-47. The snipers from the Palestinian organization watched every move of the Israeli military, waiting for the moment to fire. Other Palestinians walked with RPGs in their hands, looking for targets among the markets. The Israeli drones found them first, aiming their missiles. But the main targets were not those pawns in the game of war, but rather the Hamas leaders who began to be identified and hunted, often with the involvement of special groups like Shin Bet and Mossad. The world in 2024 reeked of gunpowder and hatred. The fire was heating the air in several countries. Sudan, Yemen, and Myanmar were living their civil wars being ignored for years. The African countries continued with revolutions, coups, and jihadists moving around, occasionally with some Russian mercenaries joining the riots. Ukraine had been facing the Russian invasion for 2 years, finding itself in an increasingly difficult situation. In the Middle East, Israel was dealing with 3 battlefronts. Gaza to the south was the first, then came the north with rockets flying from Lebanon, in addition to the airstrikes coming from Iran, which after years stopped using its sponsors and attacked on its own. Despite the region having its attention accumulated for decades, the most recent events were triggered by the terrorist attack of October 7, 2023, perpetrated by Hamas. The Al-Aqsa deluge operation attacked civilians and military personnel when Hamas men and also non-combatant Palestinians crossed the Israeli borders to kill and kidnap. The event was called Black Sabbath in Israel, with over 1,000 dead and hundreds kidnapped. Many minds and hands prepared that day, but one of the main voices was that of Yahya Ibrahim Hassan Sinwar, born in the Khan Yunis refugee camp in Gaza in 1962, when the region was still under the tutelage of Egypt. In 1989, Sinwar received a sentence of 4 life imprisonments in Israel for his involvement in the kidnapping and death of 2 Israeli soldiers and 4 Palestinians whom he considered Israeli collaborators. He spent 22 years in prison until he was released in 2011 along with another 1,026 prisoners as part of an exchange for the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit. During his time incarcerated, Sinwar continued to coordinate executions of Palestinians suspected of collaborating with Israel and planned kidnappings of Israeli soldiers. He was one of the co-founders of the Hamas security apparatus. Sinwar served as the political representative of the Al-Qassam brigades when the commander of the Zaytun battalion, Mahoud Steele, was accused of embezzlement and other so-called moral violations such as homosexuality. According to sources, Hamas believed that the fear that these accusations would become public led Stewie to provide information to Israel, resulting in the death of Mohammed Deif's wife and his 2 children when their house was bombed in August of 2014. Stewie was reportedly punished with whippings, suspended from the ceiling for hours on several days, and finally executed with 3 shots to the chest. After being elected leader of Hamas in 2017, he increasingly took command of the organization within Gaza to the point of excluding the Qatar-based leadership from many of his decisions and information. Sinwar began planning the Al-Aqsa operation in 2022 and tried to convince Hezbollah and Iran to participate. During a meeting, Sinwar acknowledged that such an attack would require sacrifices, probably referring to the people of Gaza. And these sacrifices came when Israel counterattacked. Sinwar fled to the Hamas tunnels while on the surface, children and women suffered from the bombs and saw their homes crumble in the midst of fire. Many young people walked among the rubble, fighting against the Israelis. But their retribution was more and more buildings in Gaza being thrown to the ground or over their heads while the Israeli Defense Forces continued their advances. The deaths of innocents in Gaza increased month after month. Hunger took up residence among the civilians, taking the souls of children and the weakest into the arms of death. In 2024, the hunt for the leaders of Hamas would be more intense. Little was known about where Sinwar was, but he was one of the main targets for which the soldiers searched among the ruins. The Maglan Special Forces received information about Sinwar's house in Khan Yunis. This reconnaissance unit specialized in operating behind enemy lines, using advanced technologies and weaponry. Their drones searched for hidden opponents before entering the most dangerous locations. Their forces engaged in direct combat with the Hamas soldiers who were in the region. However, after overcoming the resistance, they found no information about Sinwar's whereabouts. Still in 2023, a video emerged with Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of the Hamas leader, driving inside one of the huge tunnels under Gaza. His house was destroyed in an airstrike, which led to rumors of his death circulating. Sinwar remained missing. Meanwhile, his soldiers were fighting. Young fighters from the Al-Qassam brigades walked through the ruins of Gaza, attacking Israeli forces, almost always ambushed with rocket-propelled grenade and avoiding direct confrontations as much as possible. Commanded by Mohammed Daif, the Al-Qassam brigades were the largest and best-armed militia operating in the Gaza Strip in recent years, despite not being the only one. One of their leaders was Marwan Issa. He became one of the prominent captains of the Al-Qassam brigades in the refugee camps in the center of the Gaza Strip, playing a crucial role in the development of their military systems. Issa knew that his men were being hunted by Israel Defense Forces drones and tried to make changes in their strategies, but the Israelis were closing the net on him. First, the Israel Defense Forces released a video about what would be his house, accusing it of being of an opulence that did not match the life of other Palestinians in Gaza. Obviously, he was not found there and the search for Marwan Issa continued. He sent many of his soldiers to fire at the markets, knowing that this was an efficient strategy. They opened the tunnel exits to the surface to surprise the enemy tanks with rocket-propelled grenade fire. Others walked among the buildings to find the best firing positions. Many of these men were detected in their movements. The Israelis followed him to their hideouts and began hunting the men with missiles. The underground complex that housed the senior leaders of Hamas, including Marwan Issa, was finally found by the Israel Defense Forces. Their planes fired at the structure, destroying everything until the fire reached the Palestinian leader in March of 2024. The fact was that Shin Bet was watching. Eyes and ears inside Gaza were on the lookout for information about the Palestinian leaders. This was Israel's internal security agency, whose motto could be literally translated as defend without being seen, or more interpretively, the invisible shield. It was one of the three Israeli intelligence agencies, alongside Directorate of Military Intelligence, responsible for the military intelligence of the Israel Defense Forces, and Mossad, in charge of intelligence operations outside the country. They were the ones who discovered Ahmed's movement to Yaqub. According to Chimbet, he was responsible for the security arrangements of senior Hamas officials and served as a senior officer of the secret police department of the Rafah district. The airstrike ended Ahmed's activities in February of 2024, which may have contributed to the aforementioned fall of Marwan Issa a little later. The Israel Defense Forces discovered a 20-meter deep tunnel in Sinwar's office. His forces analyzed the entire site. This was a network that was used by the senior leaders of the organization, such as Ismail Haniyeh, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Daif, and other high-ranking officials to manage the operational routine of the organization. The forces of the 14th Reserve Combat Brigade also acted to devastate one of Sinwar's hideouts. Deep underground, they found a strategic well used by senior members of Hamas, which led to an impressive tunnel 218 meters long and almost 20 meters below the surface. In the months that followed, Chimbet enhanced his work. The agency sniffed out the Hamas leaders in their tunnels or trafficking among the ruins. Information about Muhammad Abu Hasna revealed that he was walking through Gaza. The drone found him and engulfed him in fire in March. Israel Defense Forces intelligence also recovered images that identified the movements of Sinwar and his family in one of the Gaza tunnels. The Israelis showed one of the places where the Hamas leader had been hiding, including with money and supplies left in a hurry. The Israel Defense Forces seemed to be getting closer to the target. Meanwhile, Hamas continued its fight. Even the fall of the leaders did not prevent the soldiers from continuing with their ambushes and RPGs. Their men were among the ruins, waiting for the Israelis to pass to trigger the AKs. The bodies of the enemies hit the ground without having time to understand where so many shots were coming from. The luckiest ones managed to retreat until they were ready for combat. Death blossomed in the center of Gaza where the Al-Bureij battalion operated. Bureij was a Palestinian refugee camp located in the center of the Gaza Strip, east of Salah al-Din Road. The Al-Bureij battalion was made up of about 1,000 fighters and was just one of the Hamas battalions. Their men came out of tunnels and left their traps for the Israel Defense Forces tanks. The Israeli soldiers didn't even notice the movement until they returned to their hideouts. The Hamas fighters kept moving around in search of something, always maintaining speed and stealth as their main tool in their attack. The Israel Defense Forces continued its advance into Gaza, pushing the enemy forces to the south. Their efforts closed the encirclement against the Al-Bureij battalion. Their command center was taken over. After that, Saleh Jamil Muhammad Imad, the battalion leader, was found and killed in an airstrike. Simbete was working hard within Gaza. Each new piece of information would note a new name in the Book of Death for the fire to descend from the skies and take one of the country's enemies to another world. The steps of the leaders were tracked by Jimbete. Such was the case with Ahmad Ali, commander of the Hamas naval forces. The building he was in collapsed on him in May of 2024. But there would be more at an ever-increasing speed. Danger lurked in Gaza. The EDF soldiers circulated through risk areas where the tension was enormous. It was a huge danger to climb the stairs, where they could encounter a deadly trap or be ambushed by Hamas's AKs. The men were exposed in the open field, stepping on the ground crushed by tanks, subject to snipers. Snipers proliferated throughout the Gaza Strip. The shooter's sight saw the enemy through the crack in the ruins of the building. He found 2 Israeli soldiers on watch at the top of the neighboring building. Now it was a matter of luck to know who the shot would hit. The victim was chosen, and the projectile prepared to travel down the gun barrel. The violent shot kicked up dust within the hideout and cut through the air until it hit the back of the Israeli soldier. The mere displacement in what seemed to be a quiet area exposed the soldiers to the sniper's aim. A shot passed through the man, almost taking his life and shattering against the rubble. He looked scared from the ground, still risking a headshot. A soldier was under the sniper's aim. He was an easy target, marked for death. That was until a colleague showed up to discuss the new information coming in over the radio. The projectile that traveled through the air of Gaza hit the latter. One life was saved and another ended by chance. The word safety was relative in Gaza. Snipers were everywhere. All it took was for a soldier to be exposed for the threat of his life to be brutally cut. Some of these shooters could be members of the Nucba forces, the special forces unit of the Al-Qassam brigades. Israel claimed that this unit was responsible for leading the Hamas attack in the terrorist bombing on October 7th. The members of Nucba began their long and intense training, both terrestrial and maritime, between the ages of 18 and 20, and could be selected from local fishermen. One of their leaders was Ahmed Hassan Salameh al-Swarke. He was one of those responsible for the sniper attacks in Beth Hanam. The 414th unit of the Combat Intelligence Collection Corps found him moving on top of a building. The target was promptly approved given the charges against Med due to his actions on October 7th. The Hamas commander was engulfed by fire and smoke in June of 2024. The leader's explosions were becoming more frequent. The Hamas rocket units were still quite active. The Israel Defense Forces tried many times to eliminate these launch points. The Hamas men arrived at the rocket launch site from tunnels. From these positions, they fired projectiles like the 1090 against the Israel Defense Forces or even against Tel Aviv. The Israel Defense Forces discovered some of these tunnels and destroyed them, always looking for these routes. But it was not enough. Therefore, it was important to identify Naim Al-Ghul. According to the Shin Bet Al-Ghul was involved in the launching of rockets against Israel and was among those responsible for guarding the hostage, Noah Marciano, who was killed in Gaza in 2023. Hamas said that Noah died in an Israeli airstrike, and the Israelis said she was at the Al-Tifa hospital. Naim Al-Ghul was found and Noah was avenged in May. Azimi Abu Daka, involved in smuggling weapons and funds to Hamas in Gaza, received Israeli fire a few days after Al-Ghul. A month later, the Israel Defense Forces drone targeted Hamad Salah, who participated in projects to develop strategic weapons for Hamas. Various leaders were dying, but Israel was still on the hunt for the main minds behind October 7th. Ismail Haniyeh was one of the prominent political leaders of Hamas. He was not in Gaza when Israel identified him. He lived in Qatar, where he was recorded praying and thanking for the success of the October 7th terrorist attack. In July of 2024, he left Qatar to pay tribute to the newly elected president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian. Upon returning to the place where he was staying in Tehran, he was greeted by an explosion apparently planted by Mossad. This death caused Iran to raise the red flag of revenge on the dome of the Jankaran Mosque. There was no time to cry. Mohammed Deif was one of the high-ranking officials of Hamas, leader of the Al-Qassam brigades. He escaped from nearly half a dozen elimination attempts by Israel, losing his wife and daughter in one of them. Deif had been on the wanted list of the Israeli military forces since 1995, accused of murdering both Israeli soldiers and civilians. Finally, an explosion spread in the Al-Mawasi neighborhood of Khan Yunis. This time, Mohammed Deif did not escape, nor did the commander of the Khan Yunis brigade, Rafa Salama. But they say the impact was so strong that it killed at least 90 Palestinians and more than 300 were injured, according to reports from the Gaza Health Ministry. That was in early August. Shortly after, news arrived of another prominent figure killed. Muhammad Mansour from Hamas intelligence fell in September of 2024. But Sinwar and other leaders were still missing. Sinwar himself was recorded once again in the tunnels, moving with his family, but eluding the Israelis. The fighting in Gaza was still raging in October of 2024. The snipers were lurking. They waited patiently, watching the movement of the tanks until the soldier came out. The projectile cut through the air of Gaza towards the body of an Israeli. The Al-Qassam brigades were still resisting all setbacks in their leadership. Their RPGs hit some of the Israel Defense Forces' armored vehicles head-on, saturating the vehicle with flames. Their men climbed the stairs of the buildings to shoot at the distracted soldiers inside their vehicles. The young men took risks to place improvised explosives near the tanks, running while they felt the heat of the explosion on their backs. The Israel Defense Forces tried to surround these groups in their advance through the different areas of the Gaza Strip. In Rafah in the southern strip, the Israelis blew up a Hamas ammunition stockpile. The Hamas tunnel was located in the Tel Sultan neighborhood in Rafah. It was the scene where 6 Israeli hostages were murdered by their kidnappers. The Israeli troops were able to recover the bodies of the hostages. One of the commanders of the Tel Sultan battalion, Mahmoud Handan, was one of the orchestrators of October 7th. Therefore, when he was identified, his name stood out on the list of those killed in the Israeli drone attack. The soldiers of the Bislamak Brigade noticed a suspicious action in the Tel Sultan neighborhood at 10 o'clock in the morning of October 16, 2024. They saw 3 Hamas militants coming out of a building and they shot at them. One of them ended up moving away from the others and entering a building alone, which led to a shootout between the Israeli soldiers and the man entrenched on the second floor. One of the Israel Defense Forces fighters was seriously injured by the Hamas militant, but the Israelis' shots also tore through the skin of the cornered soldier. The next order was for the troops to retreat. One of the tanks fired at the building. The explosion kicked up dust, and one of the shrapnel tore through the arm of the Hamas man. He tied an electrical cable around the injured limb, trying to improvise a tourniquet to stop the bleeding. However, the severity of the wound prevented the attempt from being effective. At that moment, the Israel Defense Forces sent their men for another sortie against that figure, still not knowing who it was. But he threw 2 grenades at the opponents. One of them exploded, but the other fell inert on the ground. Not wanting to hurt more soldiers and knowing he had safer alternatives, the commander ordered the soldiers to retreat. Fighting against a cornered man in a good defensive position was not easy. The Israel Defense Forces soldiers then sent a drone to check the status of the entrenched man. They found him in a pitiful state, bleeding and almost without the strength to try to knock down that pest, filming his debilitating moments. What happened next comes from speculation based on the autopsy, but it seems that an Israel Defense Forces sniper climbed onto neighboring buildings and, using the drone's image and the devastated wall of the second floor as a base, aimed at the battered figure. The shot burst the skull of the Hamas fighter, only after the soldiers climbed the stairs. There, they realized they had found someone who looked like Sinwar, the greatest leader of Hamas and the big boss of October 7th. In addition to weapons and money, there was a passport not related to him which belonged to a professor from the United Nations Agency for Aid to Palestinians. His identity was confirmed by a DNA test. That was a meeting of pure luck, which fatally hit Sinwar, ending once and for all his resistance and his years of leadership of Hamas. The organization's resistance did not cease after that. The fighting in Gaza still continued, with the possibility of Sinwar's brother becoming the new leader. Hard to say when it could end, but even the death of so many ideologizers of the event that triggered all the destruction did not prevent the conflicts from continuing, but the war did happen. Leaders have ideas and dreams of glory, revenge, and violence, but once their dreams become reality, they no longer have control over the nightmare they have unleashed on the world. The storm of tragedies takes on a life of its own with no deadline to run out.